The war had torn Europe apart long before most soldiers realized it wasn't just men and tanks that would decide the outcome. It was roads, rivers, and bridges. In the spring of 1940, when the German blitzkrieg smashed across France, their advance was as fast as lightning. The Luftwaffe roared overhead, and panzer divisions sliced through defenses that had taken years to build. But behind that spectacle was something far simpler: engineering. The Germans knew that when they blew a bridge, an entire army could be trapped. They didn't have to destroy every soldier, just the way forward. And so they turned every river into a wall. Bridges were mined, rigged, and detonated the moment Allied troops approached. One explosion, and thousands of tons of armor and trucks were stranded on the far bank, helpless in the mud. The Allies learned quickly that war wasn't just fought with bullets. It was fought with steel girders and wooden planks. Across France, Belgium, and later in North Africa, British and American engineers scrambled to rebuild what the enemy had destroyed. But their equipment was crude, their time short, and their losses enormous. The old methods, timber trestles, heavy cranes, and pontoon rafts, simply couldn't keep up with modern war. The new tanks, heavy and fast, would crush most temporary bridges. Convoys would wait for days, even weeks, for a crossing to reopen. Mud swallowed trucks whole. Men slept under freezing rain beside broken roads, their engines idling through the night. In the middle of all this chaos, far away from the front lines, one quiet man sat at his desk in a small, drafty office at the British War Office. His name was Donald Bailey. He wasn't a soldier or a general, and he didn't wear medals. He was an engineer, soft-spoken, bespectacled, and endlessly curious about how things fit together. While most men of his age were commanding units or fighting overseas, Bailey spent his evenings surrounded by sketches, rulers, and toy parts. Literally, on his kitchen table, among teacups and papers, sat a small construction toy set, Meccano, a child's engineering game of metal strips, bolts, and beams. To most people, it was just a toy. To Bailey, it was a prototype. He began building tiny models of bridges, experimenting with modular pieces that could lock together in different ways. What if a bridge didn't have to be built like a monument? What if it could be assembled like a puzzle? Part by hand, without cranes, without welding, and yet strong enough to carry a tank. That was Bailey's dream. A bridge that could be built by soldiers in the field, quickly, cheaply, and without special tools. When Bailey presented his first sketches to his superiors in 1940, they were polite but skeptical. Too heavy, they said. Too complicated. Too simple, said others. No one could quite understand what he was trying to do. Some thought it was madness, the idea that you could build a strong bridge using only hand tools and manpower. But Bailey persisted. He knew war was changing faster than bureaucracy could catch up. He believed the future of engineering wasn't in grand designs but in flexibility, modularity. A bridge that could be extended, strengthened, or shortened at will. One that could go up in hours, not days. By 1941, Bailey had built his first prototype in secret, not in some massive lab, but at a small testing ground in England. Soldiers were invited to try it, skeptical but curious. The pieces arrived in the back of a lorry, flat steel panels, lightweight beams, bolts, and pins. The men worked in pairs, guided by Bailey's simple instructions. They slid the panels together like puzzle pieces, pinned them at the corners, added the flooring, and within hours, a bridge stood over a river. It looked fragile, too delicate for war. Yet when the first truck drove across, it didn't bend. Then came a tank. Then another. And another. When the fourth tank rolled across without a sound, even the officers stopped speaking. What they had just built by hand could carry 30 tons of armored steel. The men cheered, and Bailey, standing at the edge of the bank, just smiled quietly. His idea had worked. Word spread quickly through the War Office. Trials continued across England, each one more daring than the last. Bailey bridges were assembled under simulated bombardments, across fast rivers, in rain and snow. Each time they held. Winston Churchill himself attended one demonstration. He watched as a line of tanks rolled across a newly built Bailey bridge, water splashing below. When it was done, He turned to his staff and said simply, "This bridge may win the war." With that, the order was given mass production immediately. Thousands of steel panels began rolling out of British factories. Every piece was identical, interchangeable, and could be carried by just a few men. A single truck could bring enough material to span a river. By late 1942, Bailey bridges were being shipped to every front, from the deserts of North Africa to the icy rivers of Norway. Meanwhile, across the lines, the Germans remained confident. Their generals laughed at Allied engineering troubles. They had seen photographs of collapsed pontoon bridges, of tanks sinking into mud. In Berlin, propaganda ministers mocked the primitive efforts of British and American engineers. "They have the men," one officer said, "but not the means." They believed their control of rivers and infrastructure would keep the Allies stalled forever. Each retreating German army blew bridges methodically, denying the enemy any easy route forward. But what they didn't know was that a revolution was already on the move. Quietly, unassumingly, thousands of Bailey Bridge components were being loaded onto ships and trucks, heading for Tunisia, Sicily, and later Italy. For the first time, the Allies had something the Germans didn't: mobility. Not just tanks or planes, but the ability to move anywhere, anytime, no matter what lay in front of them. The Bailey Bridge wasn't just a structure. It was a promise. A promise that no river, no crater, and no destruction could stop the advance. Donald Bailey's creation, born from a kitchen table, from a toy set and a stubborn dream, was about to change the entire rhythm of the war. But at that moment in 1943, few realized what that meant. The Germans still believed their defenses were unbreakable. They didn't yet understand that the quiet English engineer they'd never heard of had built the one weapon they couldn't counter: a bridge that could rebuild Europe overnight. By the winter of 1944, Europe was a graveyard of bridges. Rivers had become front lines, every crossing a deadly bottleneck where progress drowned in mud, wreckage, and fire. But in the midst of that chaos, something extraordinary began to unfold. A quiet miracle of engineering born not from weapons, but from steel, sweat, and stubborn human will. It started in Italy, where the Allied armies clawed their way up the boot of Europe under unending rain and German fire. The rivers were swollen, the valleys mined, and every bridge had been blasted apart by retreating German forces. The engineers, the forgotten soldiers of every campaign, arrived not with rifles, but with steel panels, rivets, and determination. They carried blueprints in their pockets and hope in their hands. Their task: build a bridge across the impossible. At Monte Cassino, the air was thick with smoke and thunder. The abbey above loomed like a ghost, shattered by months of bombing. Below, engineers worked knee-deep in freezing water, their hands numb, their torches flickering against the wind. They worked through the night, laying down the panels of the Bailey Bridge, each one lifted by sheer muscle and locked into place with steel pins that rang like church bells in the dark. There was no time to rest. Every few minutes, artillery shells screamed overhead, showering them with mud. Yet no one stopped. One sergeant later recalled, "We built it faster than the Germans could destroy it." By dawn, the impossible had been done. A 200-foot Bailey Bridge stretched across the river like a silver skeleton in the mist. Tanks rolled across before the sun rose, their engines growling victory into the cold morning. The bridge swayed slightly under the weight, but it held. Against every law of war, it stood strong, a monument not of concrete, but of courage. And Italy was only the beginning. In June 1944, when the Allies landed in Normandy, the Germans unleashed a new kind of retreat: destruction by denial. As their forces fell back through the French countryside, they destroyed everything behind them: railways, tunnels, and bridges. The land became a maze of broken crossings and flooded plains. Without bridges, tanks were trapped, convoys stalled, and the advance risked collapsing. But the Allies had a secret weapon: thousands of Bailey Bridge panels shipped across the Channel, stacked like giant steel puzzle pieces in depots across England. When the time came, American and British engineers unpacked them by the thousands. The countryside of Normandy echoed with the sound of hammering steel and clanking bolts. Engineers worked in 24-hour shifts, building bridges by lantern light, often under sniper fire. The rain turned fields into rivers of mud, yet they kept going. German prisoners who watched from behind barbed wire could hardly believe their eyes. A bridge that appeared from nothing, assembled like a toy, and carrying tanks within hours. One captured German general reportedly muttered, "We had destroyed France's arteries, but they built new ones overnight." Each Bailey Bridge was a small miracle of design. Its strength came not from bulk but from geometry, a triangular truss system, light enough to carry by hand, strong enough to bear 70 tons of steel and armor. It was a bridge that didn't need cranes or concrete. Just men, ropes, pulleys, and courage. In the mud and blood of war, the Bailey proved itself indestructible. The soldiers who built them called themselves Bailey's Boys. And wherever they went, roads reopened, convoys rolled, and armies advanced. By 1945, more than 2,000 Bailey bridges had been built across Europe, from the mountains of Italy to the plains of Germany. Each one shortened the war by a little, carrying not just tanks but food, medicine, and hope. To watch a Bailey bridge rise was to see pure teamwork. Panels were hauled by hand, pinned into place, trusses lifted with pulleys as men shouted commands over the roar of engines and the whistle of shells. The air rang with the sound of hammers striking steel, a rhythm that became the heartbeat of the Allied advance. Once assembled, the floor plates were bolted down, creating the path for trucks and tanks. When the final pins slid into place, there was always a moment of silence, a collective breath before the first vehicle rumbled forward. And when it held, when that first tank rolled across safely, the cheers could be heard for miles. In the months after D-Day, the Bailey became as vital to victory as the Sherman tank or the Spitfire. General Eisenhower himself called it one of the three engineering marvels that won the war alongside radar and the Jeep. It allowed the Allies to turn rivers from obstacles into highways. It turned destroyed landscapes into routes of liberation. Wherever the Bailey went, the front moved forward. By late 1944, German intelligence began to realize something was wrong. Their maps showed rivers that should have stopped the Allies for days, but every time within hours the enemy was already across. Generals demanded reports. How were they doing it? How could they rebuild bridges so fast? But no one knew. The Germans had underestimated not only American industry but also British ingenuity. They were fighting an army that could rebuild the world as it advanced. The moment that broke the myth of German superiority came at the great rivers of Europe, the Meuse, the Seine, and finally the Rhine. Each crossing had been fortified, mined, and defended with the confidence that the Allies would be delayed for weeks. Instead, the Bailey changed the game. It was light enough to carry on trucks, simple enough to assemble under fire, and strong enough to carry the heaviest tanks. One after another, the rivers fell. Footage from March 1945 shows convoys streaming over the Rhine on Bailey bridges, columns of armor stretching to the horizon. In one legendary crossing, a single Bailey bridge carried more than 10,000 tons of traffic in a single day, tanks, trucks, and endless streams of soldiers. The German dream of holding the western rivers had crumbled under the weight of steel latticework and determination. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, the Bailey Bridge became a symbol of inevitability. Wherever a river blocked the way, within hours there would be a new crossing, shining under the smoke, built by men who worked with frozen hands and fearless hearts. To the Germans, it seemed as if the enemy could rebuild the entire continent overnight. And in a sense, they did. For every bridge that fell, two rose in its place, stronger and smarter than before. The war of destruction had met its match in the war of construction. The miracle of the Bailey Bridge wasn't just that it worked. It was that it never failed. Through storms, floods, and shellfire, it carried the weight of victory itself. And as the war rolled on toward Berlin, those bridges became the veins through which the lifeblood of liberation flowed. What began as one man's kitchen table idea had turned into the spine of an entire continent's rebirth. The German generals who once laughed at Allied engineers now stared in disbelief as their armies were outmaneuvered not just by tanks and planes, but by bridges. By the spring of 1945, the guns of Europe were finally falling silent. The tanks that had once roared across Bailey bridges now rolled through cities in celebration, their steel treads echoing across the same crossings that had carried them through chaos. Those bridges, once temporary lifelines thrown together under fire, had become the quiet foundations of victory. When the dust settled and the smoke of war drifted away, the men who had fought and built began to look back and realize that without the Bailey Bridge, the war itself might have lasted far longer and cost far more. Generals who had once doubted the strange little modular structure now sang its praises. Eisenhower himself called it one of the 3 decisive weapons of the war. Not a gun, not a plane, but a bridge. Alongside the Jeep and the DC-3 transport aircraft, the Bailey Bridge stood as a symbol of Allied ingenuity. Simple, adaptable, unstoppable. It was victory carried on steel, forged not for glory but for necessity. It had turned destruction into connection and obstacles into passage. The Germans, who had mocked it in the beginning, now studied its blueprints in disbelief. Engineers from the defeated Reich pored over the design, astonished that something so light, so easy to build, could carry such unimaginable loads. What they had spent years perfecting through complexity, the Allies had achieved through elegance. As the war ended, those same bridges that had served the armies began to serve the people. Europe lay shattered, roads broken, railways torn apart, rivers clogged with wreckage. Villages were isolated, towns cut off, cities starving. The first task of peace was not rebuilding walls, but reconnecting them. And the Bailey Bridge, once a tool of war, became the bridge of peace. Military engineers, still in uniform, stayed behind to help rebuild. The same steel panels that had carried tanks over the Rhine were now carrying farmers, children, and bicycles. Across Britain, France, Belgium, and Holland, Bailey components were salvaged from depots and battlefields to create permanent crossings. In Italy, some bridges were repurposed into civilian infrastructure within months of the armistice. In Germany, the occupiers used them to reconnect shattered highways. These were bridges built for 48 hours of combat, yet they lasted 50 years of peace. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Bailey bridges became a symbol of recovery. When floods or earthquakes struck, the same modular design allowed communities to rebuild within days. Nations across Asia, Africa, and South America adopted the design for their own development projects. The British exported Bailey kits to more than 100 countries. In India, they became the backbone of Himalayan roadways. In Canada and Australia, they served remote mining and logging camps. Even in peacetime, the Bailey remained the bridge of necessity, a marvel of simplicity that continued to save lives long after the last shots were fired. Many wartime bridges still stand today. Their paint faded but their steel unbowed. Silent memorials to a generation of builders who refused to be broken. Donald Bailey himself never sought fame. While generals received medals and historians wrote volumes about the great battles, Bailey returned to his office at the British Ministry of Supply, quiet as ever. When he was knighted in 1946, he accepted the honor humbly, with the same calm modesty that had defined him all along. "It was only a bridge," he said, when asked about his invention. "The soldiers did the hard part, but those who had lived through the war knew better. They remembered the nights spent waist-deep in freezing water, hammering panels together under the flash of artillery. They remembered the way the bridge would groan as the first tank rumbled across, and the cheer that followed when it held. They knew that what Bailey had given them was more than a bridge. It was a lifeline. As time passed, Bailey's design inspired new generations of engineers. The principles of modular construction, quick assembly, and standardized parts became the foundation for modern emergency infrastructure. From humanitarian aid operations to disaster relief missions, echoes of the Bailey Bridge could be seen everywhere. His invention had outlasted the empire that built it. When the British Empire faded and Europe redefined itself, the Bailey remained. A bridge between old and new worlds, between war and peace. And yet, for all its technical brilliance, what made the Bailey Bridge extraordinary was not its steel, but its spirit. It represented the triumph of practicality over pride, simplicity over spectacle. In an age of destruction, it was an act of creation. Each panel, each rivet, Each pin was a statement that even in the darkest hours, humanity could still build something that connected rather than divided. Soldiers often spoke of the strange comfort they felt when they crossed a bailey. They said it reminded them that progress was still possible, that no river was too wide, no wound too deep to be bridged. Today, if you travel through parts of France, Italy, or rural Britain, you might still drive across a bailey bridge and not even realize it. The rusted panels, the lattice trusses, the rhythmic pattern of steel beneath your tires, all remnants of that wartime ingenuity. Some of these bridges have carried generations of farmers to their fields, children to their schools, and travelers across rivers long forgotten by war. They stand as quiet testaments to a time when victory was measured not just in battles won, but in bridges built. In museums, you might find a single bailey panel displayed beside photographs of muddy riverbanks and weary engineers. But out in the world, his bridges still do their work quietly and without complaint, just like the man who designed them. Sir Donald Bailey died in 1985, largely unknown to the public, but revered among engineers and soldiers alike. His bridge had outlived him by decades and will likely outlive another century. And so the story ends not with explosions or glory, but with something far greater: endurance. The Bailey Bridge remains one of the few creations of war that continues to serve peace. It is both monument and machine, both tool and testament. It reminds us that progress is built not only by those who fight, but by those who build. If you stand on one today, perhaps in the quiet French countryside, you might hear more than the hum of traffic. You might hear echoes of hammering steel, shouted orders, laughter in the dark, and the creak of a bridge rising from the mud. You might feel, beneath your feet, the spirit of an age when simplicity saved the world. The war was built on steel, courage, and ingenuity, and the Bailey Bridge, born from one man's humble idea, carried all three. It was not forged in the fires of destruction, but in the mind of a man who believed that simplicity could defeat chaos. And in that belief, Donald Bailey built something that outlasted war itself. A bridge not just across rivers but across time.